Welcome to the Susan Brender Show. It's all about you. Featuring shows on health and wellness, the performing arts, politics, and people who inspire you to be your very best. And now, here's Susan Brender.
This is the Susan Brender Show. Today's a very interesting person by the name of Vicki DellaSperanza, who's on our show, and she believes that the human heart breaks each time we experience loss. She says the thing about our hearts is that the most of us are pretty good at keeping them hidden. Now, if we reveal our heartache and grief, we risk opening old wounds and revisiting unsolved feelings. Or even worse, we might feel unheard, ignored, or dismissed. Now, she has so much more to tell us, so I'm going to first say, welcome to my show, Vicki DellaSperanza, and we're going to talk all about the human heart and how it really affects us in many, many different ways. So welcome to the Susan Brender Show, Vicki DellaSperanza.
Thank you, Susan. I'm thrilled to be here today.
Well, it's equal. You know, we're going to say good things about one another because, believe me, Vicki, when I read all of the information that you provided me, I knew right away that this was going to be an interesting subject. So let's continue with this. Now, grief recovery is your specialty. Talk about what that means.
Well, let me go back a little bit and explain that most of us we know how to celebrate happy occasions. We know how to acknowledge a wedding, a birthday, a graduation from high school or college. But most of us were not taught the ways in which we could acknowledge someone's grief. And what we've done as a society is we've kind of just pushed that aside and we don't talk about it. It's something that we brush aside. We're uncomfortable with it. And a griever, someone with a broken heart, is often left alone dealing with their own feelings.
Yeah.
And grief recovery is really just another way of saying how to heal a broken heart that has occurred from a loss.
You know, Vicki, grief is something that everybody seems to experience at some time in their life. But you know what? There are people who know how to deal with it and people who just don't. It's tough, isn't it?
It's very tough. And we as a society, I think that we've created certain structures in which people should be dealing with grief. And one, for example, is most of us who work at a full-time job at a business get 3 to 5 days off when we have a death in our family. And frankly, that's just not enough. And it's not that people need to take extended periods of time off. It's that it would be great if there was a re-entry back into work where they could come back or they could take time off intermittently, because grief it's not compartmentalized. It doesn't happen at one point and there's an end point.
Yeah. So what prompted you to specialize in grief support and recovery, Vicki? Because that is a tough thing, as we said before, and some people just couldn't possibly deal with it, but you seem to have a very, I call it a passion, and it really makes you feel that you need to help people. So what prompted you to specialize?
Yes, it's true, Susan. I can get very passionate about this topic. Honestly, I've experienced lots of loss in my life, not unlike most people. I lost my mom at an early age. I'm divorced. I've moved. I've lost jobs. You name it, and I've experienced it. As I became more aware that grief recovery was possible, and I realized that I could heal and I could enter what I call a new normal, I wanted to be able to bring that to others and to help other people, because helping one person manage grief is really it has an impact on all of society. It's subtle, but it's a profound impact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, for our audience, I think it's very important for them to know what the word grief means, because some people absolutely understand the fact that when somebody dies in your family or among your friends, of course, you feel grief. But what is your definition of grief?
So there are so many definitions of grief. The most basic, and the one that I come back to over and over, is grief is the normal and it's a natural emotional reaction to a loss of any kind. Grief is conflicting emotions that follow after something has ended or after a familiar pattern in our lives has ended. So it's really, as you can see, it's a simple definition for a very powerful word, because grief can consume us for many different aspects.
Right. What about strength? Where do people get the strength to be able to deal with all the problems that exist in our lives? I mean, humans are just, what can I say? Humans feel all kinds of feelings. They feel happiness, they feel sadness, they feel grief, as you said, and it's very, very hard to, identify which people have the strength to deal with it. So give me, if you understand the word strength, I want you to tell our audience how they get strength to deal with all these different things that are happening in our world.
Okay. I personally believe that everyone has the strength to cope with loss, and that once we learn some of the steps, that we can do them. So what I'm talking about is taking specific steps, using the time of grief to take certain actions that will move us forward. The individual or the group of people that pull inside and block out what's happening are usually the ones who have the hardest time rebounding from any kind of grief. Those of us who have been taught and teach other people how to move through steps that are specific steps that help us get some closure, or what we call complete and incomplete relationships. Those people are the ones that they're really not any different than you or me or anyone else. They've just been taught a skill.
Yeah. Now, you became a certified grief recovery specialist, and in 25 years you worked as a fundraiser. Now, I don't see where there is a connection to that, but somehow you became an interspiritual minister, interfaith, and this grief person. So was there one thing that set you off that made you say, I've got to do that and change my career?
Sure. There were a couple of things, and I'll touch on them briefly. So, yes, I worked as a fundraiser. I worked in the not-for-profit sector my entire life. And the work that I did was I was raising money for programs that supported people. And when I specifically worked in the areas of hospice and homelessness, I was drawn to wanting to work with the clients themselves, and I felt that this was something that it just became more powerful over time, that this was the work that I was meant to do. And I wouldn't have reached that point if I hadn't done 25 years of fundraising, so there are no regrets there at all.
Right.
But being exposed to many different not-for-profit organizations and the people who rely on their services just helped open my eyes to how widespread grief is and the need for this work. And that's what prompted me to become trained as a grief recovery specialist. I went to seminary to become an interfaith minister, because this is where I want to focus this next chapter of my life.
Yeah. Now, we have to define for our audience, and it's not really a definition, but what I want to know is there are different ages that have to experience grief because of the loss of somebody in their family, like a young kid. Do kids deal better with grief or not so much than adults? What do you think?
I think that children have the capacity to deal with grief is they get the support from the adults around them. And I'll give you an example. Often what we do is when we have a death in the family or there's a loss, a divorce, we don't talk about it in front of children. But children are extremely smart. They know what's going on. And if we help them along and we listen to them and we hear what their fears and concerns are and we give them coping mechanisms, they are quite resilient and they grow up to be resilient adults. For some reason, we've taught ourselves that we should shelter children from any type of grief. And that's where those are the kids who have difficulties managing grief as they get older.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Now, there's problems going on in our society today, such as somebody takes a gun and shoots a whole bunch of people in their schools and other places around the country. Now, this is a very horrible thing. It's horrendous, actually. And, I mean, even strangers who don't know the people who were killed, they have to deal with the grief because they're scared. You know, because if you're at the wrong place at the wrong time, boy, anything can happen. So don't you think that there is a necessity to teach people or to offer courses at colleges or high schools or junior high schools about this whole notion that anything can happen? Anything. So grief recovery as your specialty, don't you think that it would be great if there were courses in all kinds of schools about how to deal with it?
I do. I do think that the more that we become comfortable talking about grief and teaching students and teaching people that grief is a very real experience, and it's not something that has a beginning and an end. And so I think if we could teach others just even some very basic concepts, that we would be more open to people who are grieving. It's not that we intentionally close them off. Most of us just don't know what to do when someone's grieving, so we don't do anything. We're afraid we'll say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing, and we go in the completely opposite direction.
Can you list a couple of concepts that people should be aware of?
First, so some concepts about, grief can occur from, most of us assume that grief occurs after a death or a tragedy, as the ones that we've been hearing about quite a bit lately, and that is true. But grief can emerge from many different kinds of losses that are often overlooked. So naturally, a death of a child, a miscarriage is one that sometimes some of us don't focus on because we don't know what to say to the parents who've lost a child, and we don't know exactly what to do. Other examples are your child could go off to school, whether it's starting kindergarten or college. Mm-hmm. There's a grief, there's a loss there that's associated with your child growing up and moving to the next stage. Yeah. Some other quick ones that we all know about, we know divorce, the breakup of any type of romantic relationship is a grief trigger. So is the death of a pet. We sometimes forget how important pets are and how they really are members of our families.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've actually seen people and know people who have animals, cats, dogs, you name it, and when, God forbid, they see them die, and I say God forbid because I know how it affects them and my friends and family, and it's a destructive thing because you depend on your pets in some ways to be like your children. And when they die, you're faced with all that grief. And so I want to know from you, did you ever deal with people who deal with pets that have died? Because I'd like to get a little understanding of how they can kind of get through the process of grieving.
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, that I teach a specific process, but I will tell you that people who are grieving the loss of a pet are not comforted when someone else tells them, but you can get another dog or you can get another cat. We do that often with children. We say, well, we'll get another one now that, this dog has passed away. We say that we'll replace the loss. And that is not a way of coping with grief. People who've lost a pet go through the same grieving process. And as I mentioned earlier, there might not be an end point. There may be a loss, and you may be feeling better years later and see a cat that looks exactly like a cat that you had for 20 years. And it could trigger tears and a little bit of heartbreak. That's okay. That's normal. We just need to accept that this is all part of being human.
Yes. Now, we're dealing with the fact that a lot of our soldiers who are coming back from Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia and wherever they're stationed, and a lot of them have PTSD because what they see, what they experience, which is awful, absolutely awful. Now, is there nothing that you can do with people with PTSD, because there's so many coming back every week, virtually every day? So what do you think about that?
Right. Well, in general, if I were working with someone who was suffering from PTSD or depression or another problem that really required a therapist who could help them overcome the underlying issues, I would recommend that they work with that person first, and then when they are ready, that they come to me and we work on the steps of moving through grief. So it would really depend on looking at the situation. Soldiers in particular need a level of care when they first return before they would really come and meet with me.
Yeah, and I think it's important that you give us a little story of something that you've never forgotten, because there must be so many experiences that you've dealt with that, oh my God, you kind of said, wow, this is something that is a great challenge. So give us one particular story that explains how you dealt with it and how you feel about it now.
So a personal story. My mom died unexpectedly when I was 25 years old. And I don't know that grief is different I don't believe that grief is different whether it's an anticipated death or an unexpected death. But at that time in my life, I had a variety of emotions. I was 25. I was angry. I was angry that all my life was not going to be the way that I anticipated it would be. I expected to have my mom for my whole life. And then I was surrounded by people who were well-meaning and said things to me like, oh, don't worry, your dad will meet someone else. He'll have another relationship. That was not a comforting comment while I was in the depths of grief.
Yes.
The other thing that was important that I remember vividly is that I needed to talk about it. I wanted to tell friends that I knew and colleagues. I wanted to talk about it. I wanted to describe this whole experience of what it was like to be at the graveside and watch my mother's, coffin being lowered, because I needed to do that. And as soon as I would begin to speak about it, people get a deer in the headlights look, or they shut down. And so I learned early on, don't talk about grief. And if you do need to talk about it, you're going to talk to yourself, or you're going to go to a professional therapist. But your general friends, family are not equipped to listen to these stories.
Well, now I'm going to sort of change the subject for a second, and I'm going to talk about people today who have been diagnosed with horrible diseases like cancer, heart disease, you name it. It just seems like when people are diagnosed with cancer, they're just beside themselves. Now, that's a kind of connection to what you were talking about before about dealing with grief. But I want to know, if somebody has, as I said, all of these different diseases, is it different the way you will treat them, or is it the same?
I would treat someone who just received a diagnosis of a serious illness, the same way that I would work with someone experiencing any other loss. I would help them recognize what it is that they feel that they're losing. Often someone's diagnosed with an illness and they don't have any symptoms for a while, so it takes some time before they realize what they will be losing. Other times people have a serious illness and they went one day from walking to the next day to not being able to. And that's very obvious that they've now lost an important component of their daily life. So I would help them take a look at the loss and understand what the loss is and what it is that they need to do to move forward, not to forget it and not to pretend that it's not there, but to be able to live wholly and fully in what I always call it's a new normal. We can't go backwards, but we can move into a new normal. I just want to mention that there's a misnomer that there are stages of grief, because we all know, most of us learned that there are stages of death.
Right. And
somehow over the years they've been associated with grief. So I will tell you that there are no stages of grief. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who developed the concept of the stages of death, herself even said it was never her intention for those stages to be associated with grief. Grief comes in waves. It's secular. Sometimes people loop back and forth depending on where they are in the process, whereas stages of grief really do proceed through one stage after another.
Right. Vicki, have you ever thought about writing a book or some kind of pamphlet that can be given to people who, not just the normal people, so that they can understand a little bit better how to deal with all of these issues that you're talking about? A book, a movie, a documentary, anything like that?
Absolutely. Yes, my hope and my intention is to write a book for people who are supporting grievers, so that they, almost like a little handbook on, well, what should I do? What are some things that I can say that might be of a support? What are the things that might not be so helpful to say, but they've been ingrained in me because I've heard them since I was a child? So there are lots of books and lots of materials and documentaries for someone who is in the depths of grief. And I would like to offer something to the rest of society and help move us, kind of like shift us into a different perspective of that there's a lot that we can do and that we don't need to be afraid of grief.
You know, I want to tell you a little story because I'm really pleased that we're having this discussion. I have a friend who unfortunately was diagnosed with a very serious cancer. And every time I call her, because I definitely want to speak to her and give her support, but I don't know what to say. I have to feel. Of course she doesn't feel well, so I know that. And then I'll say to her, well, is there anything I could do for you now? And she'll kind of quiet down and think and say to me, what could you do for me? And I keep on saying, I want to support you. I want to support you. But I really don't know what to say. Could you give me a little advice about that?
Oh, yes. The first thing is, asking someone how they're doing is perfectly reasonable, but you might want to say, how's today? How are you doing today? What does today feel like for you? Because you know the person is dealing with the significant illness, so you already know that they're grieving at what they might not have. But you can call and say, how is today for you? Because you might be surprised. Someone might say, I woke up, I actually feel a little stronger. I went for a walk. Or they might say, this is not a great day, and I really am having a tough time. And to give someone the opportunity to say whatever it is that they're feeling. We tend to ask each other, how are you, without really waiting for a response. So that's why I say just add today to the end of the sentence. The other thing is, when you have a friend, a close one, a loved one that you want to support, be proactive. Give them a call and say, how about if I come over Tuesday night and I'll bring dinner and we can sit and watch a sappy movie together, or whatever it is that you decide that you like to do. Maybe you like to play Scrabble together.
Right.
But it's up to the support individual to take the initiative, because someone who's grieving they're not thinking. They're in a confused state.
Sure.
They're exhausted, and they don't necessarily know what they need. And they don't. Some people might not even know that, you coming over and just smuggling under Afghans with me and watching TV is exactly what I need.
Right.
So it's important that you put the offer out there and then follow through.
Mm-hmm. I hear you, because I feel so strongly that it's so important to have the support. If, God forbid, something was wrong with me, I certainly would love that. Now, humor. I want to talk a little bit about humor. Do you put humor in your the way you kind of deal? I'm saying something wrong here. I just want to know about humor in your career. Do you need humor to get people to feel a little bit better? Because humor makes everybody feel so good. Don't you agree with me?
Well, I'm going to say yes and no, because yes, humor makes most of us feel good. It makes most of us laugh. But when we're helping someone who's grieving, we are not necessarily looking to cheer them up. What we are trying to do, what we should be doing, is validating the feelings that they're experiencing. Now, if you're supporting someone who happens to be a real jokester, someone who's a wisecracker, then by all means, but go right ahead and do it. I know someone who sent a friend, instead of a dozen roses when she was diagnosed with an illness, he sent her a dozen clown noses. And that fit for that particular relationship.
That's great.
But humor, yeah, it was wonderful. And I knew that person personally, so we were all walking around with clown noses. It was, and it did make us all laugh during a very difficult time.
Right.
But what happens is there's no need to cheer up a person who's grieving. They are not looking to be cheered up. They need to move through a grief process. Yeah. And they just need to know that everything they're feeling is okay and accepted.
I hear you. Now, for listeners who've been affected by what they've heard today, what should they do?
Well, there are a couple of things that I would like to recommend. The first one is know that you are completely normal. If you are feeling grief, there's nothing wrong with you. Grief is the normal and natural reaction to any change in your life. The next step, I would say, is to remember that recovery is possible. And recovery isn't something where one day we flip a switch and one day we feel better. Recovery into a new normal, a new life, a different life is very possible, and you can get there. It's just a matter of working through some specific steps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And knowing that there is some closure on the other side. I'll just recommend that if someone would like to go to my website, my website is www.Rev.Vicki.com. Vicki is spelled Vicki. I have a couple of things on my website, one which is an ebook that can be downloaded for free, which talks about the myths of grief and is helpful for someone who is grieving, and it's also helpful for someone who's assisting a griever.
Right.
And I'll also put it out there that if someone wishes to contact me, I'd be more than happy to schedule a 15-minute consult and talk about whether or not I can be helpful or whether I would refer someone to another counselor. But I want to just put that out there. Most of us who are grieving, we keep it hidden.
Right.
And I'm just putting it out there and saying, I'm here to listen.
Yeah, there you go. Now, before we go, would you leave us with a few little pieces or nuggets of hope, help, or inspiration?
Sure. So recovery is possible. Recovery means being able to look back and enjoy fond memories without having them become painful.
Right.
So one aspect of recovery. Recovery is also acknowledging that it's okay to feel sad from time to time, and it's okay to talk about those feelings and not worry about what someone else is thinking. One that's very important is it's okay for everyone, the griever and the support person, to talk about the loss, to bring up, not to, sometimes we don't say the name of the person who's passed away, or if there's been a miscarriage, we don't talk about the baby, and we just pretend that it's that this experience didn't happen. So we need to be more open as a society in acknowledging and embracing and knowing that grieving is a big part. If we live, we grieve. We just, one doesn't go without the other.
Yeah, I hear you. Well, my guest today has been Vicki DellaSperanza, who is very interesting. She has so many different pieces of advice for people who are grieving. And as she said before, there's practically nobody who doesn't experience it in their lives. So Vicki gave you the information. Just to repeat 1 second more, Vicki, how they get in touch with you.
My website address is Rev.Vicki.com. And remember that Vicki is spelled Vicki. You can also email me at Vicki@ReverendVicki.com. And send me a message and tell me how to get in touch with you, and we can schedule a time to talk on the phone. I work with people in person, on the phone, through Skype. There's a lot of ways that I can provide assistance for you. So please do reach out to me.
Well, thank you so much, Vicki, for being on the Susan Brender Show. It certainly has been an interesting show with all of the knowledge that you seem to have and all the passion. So I want to thank you again for being on the Susan Brender Show.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share this important topic that I'm so passionate about, and to help other people become more at ease with it. I really appreciate it.
Me too. I appreciate your being on the show.
Thank you for listening to The Susan Brender Show. To be a guest, email sebrender@yahoo.com.